delighted to be joined today by Andrew Block, who's a partner in the Mayer Brown pension practice. And we're going to be talking about the impact that the turmoil in the bonds market in the UK has had on pensions. Andrew, I appreciate you're not an economist, but we're sat here today on the 18th of October. So can you just talk about what the rise in gilt yields, the impact it's had on pension funds?
Thank you. Well, it's a simple question, but I'm afraid the answer is a little complicated. So what matters to a pension fund isn't the absolute value of its assets, it's the value of its assets compared to the value of its liabilities. So how do you calculate the value of its liabilities? Well, the value of its liabilities is the value of pensions that are going to be paid, and those change depending on inflation, because a lot of pensions are linked to inflation, and how long people are actually going to live. And those are unknown and unknowable. But actuaries have, through years and years of research, been able to be in a position of having a very good guess as to what those cash flows will be. But then you have to work out what the net present value of those cash flows is in order to be able to compare them with the value of your assets to see whether you've got enough. And those are discounted back using measures linked to gilt yields. And that's partly for regulatory reasons, and it's also partly because a gilt behaves in a little bit like a pension in that it's an income stream that carries on for a time and then stops. So one effect of the rise in gilt yields and the fall in the value of gilts is that the value that's put on the liabilities of these schemes has fallen, which from a pension scheme is good news because it means you've got fewer liabilities. But the flip side of that is that the value of LDI assets held by the scheme has also fallen. And let me just explain what that is, because I appreciate pensions uses a lot of jargon. So if you have liabilities that are calculated linked to bond yields, one way of matching those liabilities is to invest in bonds, in gilts. But the problem is, if you do that, then you're never ever going to get a situation where the value of your investments rises more than the value of your liabilities. And most schemes are in deficit. And so what employers and trustees want is some of the investments to do the heavy lifting for them, rather than asking for all the cash from the employers to make good that deficit. They'd like some investment growth to do that. So what they tend to do is they'll invest, say, 3/4 of their assets in investments that will generate income growth, and 1/4 in assets that will match the value of the liabilities of the scheme. So what they'll do is they'll buy units in a unitised fund, and the fund manager will borrow, usually 3-4 times what the pension scheme invests, and enter into derivative contracts, swaps, that will move in the same way as the liabilities move. But because these are swaps, these are derivatives, and because you've got borrowed money, you need collateral. So the pension scheme will be posting collateral. And what happened as the gilt yields rose, the value of those contracts to the fund manager fell, and so the fund manager started wanting more collateral. And the pension schemes are looking for assets to sell to post the collateral. The most liquid asset they've got are gilts. So they sell the gilts to post the collateral, and that causes gilt yields to rise even more and the value of gilts to fall even more. And so you get this doom loop that the Bank of England had to step in to stop.
And what have the pension schemes themselves looked to do to protect themselves?
So what they have done is sought sources of assets that they can post as collateral, that aren't assets that they've got that they're going to have to sell at a discount in order to generate the income to post as collateral. So we've seen pension schemes enter into borrowing facilities with their employers so that they can borrow cash from the employers to post as collateral, so they don't have to sell assets to do that. And we've also, to a much more limited extent, seen pension schemes enter into borrowing arrangements with external banks in order to do that.
And what impact, so we've seen obviously the Bank of England doing an emergency gilt buying programme. What impact has that had on the pension funds?
Well, it's bought them time to put these arrangements in place. I think the biggest impact has probably been the change of tack from the government, which has calmed the gilt markets down a bit and given them a bit more breathing space. But of course, last week we didn't know that was going to happen, so hence the putting in place loan arrangements.
And as that intervention programme has come to an end, is there still a risk that pension funds could actually collapse?
Well, there never was a risk that pension funds could collapse, and this is one of the points I'd like to get across. So What would have happened if pension schemes had run out of collateral or had decided that they couldn't post any more is that the protection they'd have for their liabilities and assets moving in the same way would have had to been cut back. So the manager would have taken off the hedges. And so what you would have had is a situation where the assets and the liabilities of the pension scheme might have moved in different directions. Pension schemes by law have to have an actuarial valuation at least once every 3 years. So at that actuarial valuation, you'd have had a situation where maybe the deficit would have got bigger. And that deficit doesn't have to be plugged overnight. There's quite a lot of law and guidance from the pensions regulator on how long employers have got to plug the deficit and what proportion can come from investment returns and what proportion can come from employer contributions. But what you would have seen is possibly a hike in the contributions required by employers over the medium term. Now, not great, as we seem to be heading into a recession, but not an overnight collapse.
Okay. And what steps are you seeing pension funds taking to actually limit these risks?
Well, as well as the putting in place borrowing facilities, we're seeing pension schemes look at their LDI portfolios, and as we move into a more high inflation environment, just rethink their investment strategies to see whether or not they remain appropriate.
And do you think we'll see a change in investment strategies for funds?
Possibly. We're certainly seeing funds look at investment strategies in the light of higher inflation expectations.
And going back to the collapse point, but if one did happen to collapse, what would be the effect of that on employers or individuals?
So on an individual, if the pension scheme collapsed and there wasn't enough money to pay the individual's pension, that individual's pension would be cut back, but there is a limit because there's something called the Pension Protection Fund, which is effectively an insurance lifeboat for pension schemes that would step in and would provide pensions up to a cap. And the exact rules on that are quite complex. I won't go into them now, but there is that level of protection. For employers, it's quite rare that you have a strong solvent employer that's brought down solely by the pension scheme. Usually what happens is it's an employer that's not doing particularly well. You've got other creditors, you've got the pension scheme as a creditor, and the increase in pension liabilities can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. But I'm hoping I'm right in this, but I don't think we're going to see a wave of corporate collapses caused by demands from their pension schemes.
Thanks. And you and I were sat here in London, obviously in the UK, but if we look wider, are other countries experiencing similar issues to here?
Not as far as I know. So the UK, we're quite unusual in having the funded pension scheme set up that we do. You've got that in Ireland, the Netherlands, to an extent, the US, but many places the pension schemes are unfunded, so they don't have this potential of a mismatch between assets and liabilities. And also, as far as I understand it, it's only in the UK that gilt yields have really spiked. Other sovereign debt in the States, in the Eurozone, hasn't.
And do you expect, as a result of all of this turmoil, do you think we're going to see more regulation in your area?
Well, the pensions regulator has already issued some guidance. I think in the short term, no, but my guess is in the medium to long term, someone at the Bank of England or the PRA is looking at the extent to which this all poses systemic risk, so possibly.
And finally, Andrew, thank you so much for going through all of that with us. What would be your key takeaways for any of our clients who are watching today?
Thank you. Well, for pension scheme trustees, don't panic, talk to your investment consultants, and if you have a strong employer behind you, there really is no reason to panic. It's a long-term game. And for employers, I think understand what your pension scheme trustees are doing, understand their investment strategy, and go and talk to them.